The African sun blazed mercilessly over the Ruaha National Park in Tanzania, turning the landscape into a furnace of cracked earth and withering vegetation. James Mwangi had been a ranger for 23 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would witness during the worst drought the region had seen in half a century. The year was 2019, though what happened that September afternoon would remain etched in his memory as vividly as if it were yesterday. James was conducting his routine patrol along the dried riverbed that once carried the life-giving waters of the great Ruaha River. The skeletal remains of acacia trees cast meager shadows across the barren ground, their branches reaching toward the sky like desperate fingers pleading for rain. The usual symphony of wildlife had been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional cry of vultures circling overhead, waiting for death to claim another victim of the relentless drought. It was the faint sound that caught his attention first, something between a whimper and a growl, so weak it could have been mistaken for wind through the dead grass. James stopped his patrol vehicle and listened. There it was again, coming from a cluster of rocks about 50 meters from what used to be the riverbank. His years of experience told him to approach with caution. Even dying animals could be dangerous, especially predators driven to desperation by hunger and thirst. As he drew closer, rifle at the ready, but hoping he wouldn't need it, James saw her. The lioness lay on her side beneath a small overhang of rock that provided minimal shade. Her ribs protruded sharply through her tawny coat, which had lost its golden luster and hung loosely on her emaciated frame. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath seeming to cost her tremendous effort. But it wasn't the sight of the dying lioness that made James's heart skip a beat. It was the 3 tiny cubs huddled against her belly, their eyes barely open, too weak to even cry. James estimated the cubs couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old. At that age, they were entirely dependent on their mother's milk for survival. From the look of the lioness, she hadn't eaten in weeks, maybe longer. Her body had consumed itself trying to produce milk for her babies, and now she had nothing left to give. The cubs' bellies were swollen with hunger, a cruel irony of starvation that made them appear fed when they were actually dying. The ranger knew the statistics. In drought conditions like these, lion cub mortality could reach 90%. These 3 would be dead within hours, maybe less. Their mother might last a day or 2 more, but her fate was equally sealed. James had witnessed nature's cruelty many times, had learned to accept it as part of the cycle of life and death that governed the wild. But something about this scene, perhaps the way the lioness's eyes followed his movements with a mixture of wariness and something that looked almost like hope, made him pause. He returned to his vehicle and radioed back to headquarters. The response was what he expected. The park's policy was clear: no intervention in natural processes. The drought was natural, and the deaths it caused, while tragic, were part of the ecosystem's balance. But James found himself arguing with his supervisor, something he'd never done in over 2 decades of service. These cubs were part of a pride that had already lost several members to the drought. The local lion population had dropped by 30% in the last year alone. Surely, he reasoned, one small act of mercy couldn't upset the balance too much. After a heated discussion, his supervisor reluctantly gave him permission to leave water, nothing more. It was a small concession, but James knew even that was bending the rules significantly. He retrieved a large basin from his vehicle and filled it with water from his emergency supply. As he approached the lioness again, she lifted her head slightly, a growl rumbling in her throat. It was a warning, but a weak one. She couldn't even stand to defend her cubs. James placed the water basin about 10 feet from where she lay and retreated to his vehicle to watch. What happened next challenged everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. The lioness looked at the water, then at her cubs, then back at the water. She tried to stand but collapsed immediately. She tried again, this time managing to drag herself a few inches before her strength failed. On her 3rd attempt, using what must have been superhuman effort for her weakened state, she managed to half-crawl, half-drag herself to the basin. But instead of drinking, she did something extraordinary. She looked back at her cubs, who were too weak to follow, then back at the water. She dipped her muzzle into the basin, but didn't drink. Instead, she seemed to be testing it, making sure it was safe. Only then did she take a few small laps, just enough to wet her throat. Then, with effort that was painful to watch, she dragged herself back to her cubs. James watched, fascinated, as the lioness began to groom the smallest cub with her newly moistened tongue, trying to revive it. The cub stirred slightly, and she continued, moving to the next one, then the third. She was using the water not to save herself, but to try to revive her babies. She repeated this process 3 times, each journey to the water basin obviously costing her precious energy she didn't have to spare. The ranger couldn't stand it anymore. He radioed headquarters again, this time not asking for permission, but stating his intention. He was going to feed the lioness. His supervisor's protest crackled over the radio, but James turned it off. He'd face the consequences later. From his vehicle's emergency supplies, he retrieved something rangers weren't supposed to carry, but many did. Dried meat meant for extreme survival situations. It wasn't much, maybe 2 pounds, but it was something. This time, when he approached, the lioness didn't even try to growl. She watched him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence, an understanding that this human was not a threat. James placed the meat closer than the water, within her reach without having to move. Then he retreated again, but not to his vehicle. Something made him sit on a rock about 20 feet away, far enough to be safe but close enough to observe. The lioness sniffed the meat, and for a moment, James thought she would devour it immediately. Her body certainly needed it. But once again, she defied expectation. She tore off a small piece and chewed it slowly, carefully. Then she regurgitated it, partially digested, and nudged it toward the largest of her cubs. The cub, smelling food, managed to consume the small offering. She repeated this with each cub, eating only enough herself to continue producing what little milk she could. James stayed there for hours, well past the end of his shift. As the sun began to set, painting the drought-stricken landscape in shades of gold and crimson, he made a decision that would either cost him his job or change everything. He would not let this family die, not on his watch. He began making plans, calculating how much water and food he could bring without being noticed, which routes to take to avoid other rangers, how to document the lioness's condition to build a case for official intervention. Over the next 3 days, James returned in secret. Each time, the lioness seemed to recognize him, no longer showing any sign of aggression. By the 4th day, she was strong enough to stand and walk a few steps. The cubs, receiving regular nutrition through their mother's milk, began to show signs of life. Their eyes opened fully, and they started to move around, though still weakly. It was on the 5th day that everything changed. James arrived at the usual spot to find the lioness standing, still thin, but no longer on death's door. The cubs were nursing, their tiny tails twitching with contentment. As James set down the day's provisions, the lioness did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, in the best possible way. She walked toward him, slowly, deliberately. James froze, his training screaming at him to retreat, but something kept him rooted in place. She stopped just out of arm's reach and sat down, her eyes never leaving his. Then she lowered her head, not in submission, but in what could only be described as a bow. She held the position for several seconds before turning and walking back to her cubs. It was a gesture of gratitude so clear, so unmistakable, that James felt tears running down his cheeks. But the story doesn't end there. Word of James's actions had reached his supervisors, and he was called in for a disciplinary hearing. He faced suspension, possibly termination. The park's board of directors was divided. Some argued that he had violated the fundamental principle of non-interference. Others pointed out that human activity, including the diversion of water for agriculture that had worsened the drought's impact, meant that the situation wasn't entirely natural to begin with. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. James prepared his defense, gathering data on lion populations, the impact of human activity on the drought, anything that might support his case. But 3 days before the hearing, something unexpected happened. A wildlife photographer who had been documenting the drought's impact had captured everything on a long-range lens. The photos showed the lioness's condition, James's intervention, and most remarkably, that moment of gratitude. The photographer, Sarah Chun, was internationally renowned. When she posted the images online with the full story, they went viral within hours. Millions of people around the world saw the skeletal lioness, the dying cubs, and the ranger who chose compassion over rules. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in for the park's conservation efforts. International wildlife organizations offered support. The story was picked up by major news outlets, and suddenly, James Mwangi was not facing termination, but was being hailed as a hero. The park's board had no choice but to reconsider. They not only dropped all disciplinary action against James, but also created a new protocol for extreme situations where human intervention might be justified. The Drought Emergency Intervention Program, as it came to be known, would allow rangers to provide life-saving assistance to endangered species during severe environmental crises, particularly those exacerbated by human activity. But the most remarkable part of the story was yet to come. The lioness, whom James had named Shujaa, meaning brave one in Swahili, not only survived but thrived. Her cubs grew strong and healthy. The photographer Sarah Chun returned monthly to document their progress, and her photos showed something unprecedented. Whenever James's patrol vehicle appeared, Shujaa would approach, not for food, but seemingly just to acknowledge his presence. She would sit near his vehicle for a few moments, her cubs playing around her, before returning to her normal activities. Wildlife behaviorists were fascinated. This wasn't habituation in the traditional sense. Shujaa didn't approach other vehicles or humans. She didn't become dependent on human feeding. Once the drought ended and prey animals returned, she hunted successfully and taught her cubs to do the same. But she remembered James, and she seemed to understand that he had saved her family when nature would have let them die. A year later, when the rains had returned and the landscape was green again, James was patrolling the same area where he'd first found Shujaa. He spotted her resting under a tree with her cubs, now almost fully grown. As his vehicle approached, she lifted her head and looked directly at him. For a moment, they held each other's gaze across the distance. Then something extraordinary happened. All three cubs, who had never directly interacted with James since they were tiny, stood and faced his direction. Following their mother's lead, they each lowered their heads in that same distinctive bow before settling back down. The significance of this wasn't lost on James or the behavioral scientists who later analyzed the footage from his vehicle's camera. Shujaa had somehow communicated to her cubs that this particular human was special, was safe, was to be respected. It was a learned behavior, passed from mother to offspring, that suggested a level of emotional complexity and memory that challenged conventional understanding of lion cognition. Dr. Marcus Webb, a renowned wildlife behaviorist from Oxford who came to study the case, said something that perfectly captured the implications of what had occurred. We've always known that animals can remember negative experiences with humans, can teach their young to fear us. What we're seeing here is evidence that they can also remember kindness, can recognize individual humans as allies rather than threats, and most remarkably, can pass this knowledge to their offspring. It fundamentally challenges our understanding of the emotional lives of these magnificent creatures. The story took another turn 2 years after the initial rescue. A severe injury from a failed hunt left Shujaa unable to provide for her now independent cubs, who had formed their own pride. Rangers found her weakened and infected, unlikely to survive without intervention. This time, there was no debate. The new protocols were clear, and Shujaa was transported to a veterinary facility within the park for treatment. During her recovery, something remarkable was observed. While most wild lions require sedation for medical treatment, Shujaa remained calm when James was present. She would allow veterinarians to approach and treat her as long as James was in her line of sight. It was as if she understood that these humans, like James, were trying to help her. The trust she had developed with one human had evolved into a broader understanding that not all humans were threats. After 3 weeks of treatment, Shujaa was released back into the wild. The release was emotional for everyone involved, but especially for James. As the cage was opened and Shujaa stepped out, fully recovered, she paused. She looked back at James one more time, held his gaze for a long moment, and then disappeared into the bush. It was the last time they would have such a close encounter. Shujaa lived for another 8 years, a respectable age for a wild lioness. She had 2 more litters, raising them successfully through various challenges, including another, though less severe, drought. Rangers would occasionally spot her during patrols, and she would always acknowledge them with what became known as Shujaa salute, that distinctive head bow that she had somehow taught to all her offspring. When she finally passed, it was from natural causes, surrounded by her pride. James was the one who found her body during a routine patrol. Even in death, she was magnificent. The park held a special ceremony, unusual for a wild animal, but Shujaa had become more than just another lioness. She had become a symbol of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife, a testament to the possibility of coexistence and mutual respect. The impact of Shujaa's story rippled far beyond the boundaries of Ruaha National Park. Conservation programs worldwide began reconsidering their non-intervention policies, recognizing that in a world where human activity increasingly affects wildlife, complete non-intervention might sometimes be more harmful than helpful. The Shujaa Protocol, as it came to be known, was adopted by numerous parks and reserves, allowing for compassionate intervention in extreme circumstances. James continued his work as a ranger for another decade before retiring. He became a sought-after speaker at conservation conferences, sharing not just the story of Shujaa, but the deeper message it carried. "We always talk about teaching animals to fear humans for their own safety," he would say, "but Shujaa taught me that maybe we should also be teaching them that some humans can be trusted. That coexistence isn't just about maintaining distance, but about recognizing that we share this planet. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can bridge the gap between species in ways we never imagined possible." The cubs that James saved went on to have cubs of their own, and those cubs had cubs. Today, several prides in the Ruaha area can trace their lineage back to Shujaa. Rangers have noted something remarkable about these descendants. They show less aggression toward vehicles, are more tolerant of human presence at safe distances, and most remarkably, some have been observed performing that distinctive head bow when encountering rangers who have helped them in some way, whether treating injuries or removing snares. Dr. Sarah Chun, the photographer whose images had saved James's career, published a book about Shujaa and her legacy. In it, she wrote, "In an age where we're constantly reminded of the damage humans do to wildlife, Shujaa's story reminds us that we also have the capacity for compassion, for making choices that transcend policy and protocol in service of something greater. She showed us that trust between species isn't just possible, it's hereditary, teachable, and perhaps essential for the future of conservation." The book included a photograph that became iconic in conservation circles. It showed James, years after the initial rescue, standing at a respectful distance from Shujaa and her adult cubs. All 4 lions are facing the camera, their heads slightly lowered in that distinctive gesture of acknowledgement. James stands with his hand over his heart, returning the salute. The image captures a moment of perfect understanding between species, a silent conversation that says more than words ever could. But perhaps the most profound impact of Shujaa's story was on the local communities around the park. The Maasai people, who had long viewed lions as threats to their livestock, were moved by the story of mutual respect between the ranger and the lioness. Several villages began implementing new practices for coexistence, using non-lethal methods to protect livestock while allowing lions to maintain their territories. The story of Shujaa became part of local folklore, told around fires to children who would grow up with a different understanding of their relationship with the wildlife around them. One such child was Marcus Katanga, whose grandfather had lost several cattle to lion attacks over the years. Inspired by Shujaa's story, Marcus pursued a career in wildlife biology, eventually becoming one of the leading experts on human-lion conflict resolution. Shujaa showed us that lions aren't just mindless killers, he would later write in his doctoral thesis. They're capable of discretion, of gratitude, of passing on cultural knowledge to their offspring. Once we understand this, we can begin to build a different relationship with them. The scientific community was equally impacted. Shujaa's case sparked numerous studies on animal cognition, emotional intelligence, and the capacity for interspecies relationships. Researchers discovered that lions, like elephants and great apes, have complex social memories that can span years and even generations. They found evidence that lionesses teach their cubs not just hunting techniques, but also social information about their environment, including which humans to trust and which to avoid. One particularly groundbreaking study followed the descendants of Shujaa over 5 years, documenting their interactions with humans. The research showed that these lions had lower stress hormone levels when encountering familiar rangers compared to other lion populations, suggesting that the trust Shujaa had developed had indeed been passed down through generations. This finding revolutionized understanding of how conservation efforts could work with, rather than around, the emotional intelligence of wildlife. As years passed, the spot where James first found Shujaa became something of a pilgrimage site for conservationists and wildlife enthusiasts. A small, unobtrusive plaque was installed, reading simply, "Here in the drought of 2019, a choice was made that proved compassion knows no species." In memory of Shujaa, who taught us that trust, once earned, can echo through generations. James would often return to that spot, especially after his retirement. He would sit on the same rock where he had watched Shujaa make the impossible choice to trust a human with her life and the lives of her cubs. On one such visit, on the 5th anniversary of Shujaa's death, he was surprised to find he wasn't alone. A young lioness, clearly one of Shujaa's descendants based on distinctive markings, was resting nearby with her own cubs. As James watched, the lioness noticed his presence. She stood, and for a moment, James wondered if she would leave. Instead, she performed that familiar head bow, then settled back down, allowing her cubs to continue playing. James sat there for hours, watching the cubs tumble and wrestle, their mother keeping one eye on them and occasionally glancing in his direction with what he could only describe as acknowledgement. It was in that moment that James fully understood the magnitude of what had happened all those years ago. It wasn't just about saving one lioness and her cubs from starvation. It was about planting a seed of possibility, showing that the relationship between humans and wildlife didn't have to be defined by fear and conflict. It could be built on respect, understanding, and yes, even trust. The sun was setting as James finally stood to leave, painting the landscape in the same golden hues as on that day when Shujaa had first bowed to him in gratitude. As he walked back to his vehicle, he heard a soft chuff behind him. He turned to see the young lioness standing, watching him go. She lowered her head once more, holding it for a long moment before turning back to her cubs. James smiled, understanding that this was not an ending, but a continuation. Shujaa's legacy lived on, not just in her descendants, but in the changed hearts and minds of everyone her story had touched. The impossible choice she had made, to trust when every instinct must have screamed against it, had created ripples that continue to spread, changing the very fabric of conservation efforts across Africa and beyond. Years later, when asked to summarize what Shujaa had taught him, James would say, "She showed me that animals don't just respond to what we do. They remember who we are. They can forgive, they can trust, and most remarkably, they can teach their young that not all humans are enemies." In a world where we're rapidly losing wildlife to human expansion, this might be our only hope for coexistence. Not just teaching animals to fear us enough to stay away, but showing them that we can be partners in survival. The story of Shujaa and James became required reading in conservation programs worldwide. It challenged the traditional hands-off approach to wildlife management and suggested that in extreme circumstances, compassion could be as important as scientific protocol. It sparked debates that continue to this day about the role of human intervention in nature. But one thing was undeniable. Sometimes, the most profound connections happen when we dare to bridge the gap between species with simple acts of kindness. Today, The Ruaha National Park has one of the most successful lion conservation programs in Africa. The population that had dropped by 30% during that terrible drought has not only recovered, but grown beyond pre-drought numbers. The descendants of Shujaa continue to thrive, and rangers report that these prides show remarkable tolerance for the ecotourism that helps fund conservation efforts, as if understanding on some level that human presence can mean protection rather than threat. The final chapter of this story, however, belongs not to James or even to Shujaa's descendants, but to a young girl named Amara, whose school visited the park 10 years after Shujaa's death. During a guided safari, their vehicle encountered a pride led by one of Shujaa's great-granddaughters. The guide was explaining the famous story when the lioness approached their vehicle, something that made everyone hold their breath. The lioness walked slowly around the vehicle, her amber eyes scanning the faces of the visitors. When she reached where Amara sat, she paused. The 8-year-old girl, who had been told stories of Shujaa by her grandmother, slowly raised her small hand to her heart and lowered her head. The lioness stood perfectly still for a moment, then returned the gesture with that distinctive bow before padding back to her pride. The guide, a veteran of 20 years, later said he had never seen anything like it. It was as if the lioness recognized something in the child's gesture, an echo of the respect that had begun with James and Shujaa all those years ago. Amara would grow up to become a wildlife veterinarian, dedicating her life to continuing the work that James had started, proving that the bridge between species, once built with compassion, could span generations. The story ends where it began, with a drought, though this one came 15 years after Shujaa's rescue. Climate change had made such events more frequent and severe. But this time, the response was different. The protocols established after Shujaa's case meant that rangers could intervene early, providing strategic support to struggling wildlife populations. No lioness would have to make the impossible choice Shujaa had faced. During this drought, an old James, now in his 70s, returned to the park as an advisor. On one patrol, rangers encountered a struggling lioness with cubs, eerily reminiscent of that day so many years ago. But this lioness, a descendant of Shujaa, showed no fear when the rangers approached with water and food. She seemed to understand that help was being offered, accepting it with a dignity that spoke of generational memory. As James watched the young rangers work, following protocols he had helped establish, he thought of Shujaa. She had been dead for many years, but her impact lived on in every compassionate intervention, in every moment of trust between human and lion, in every cub that learned from its mother that some humans could be allies rather than enemies. The ranger who had found this lioness, a young woman named Grace who had been inspired to join the service after hearing Shujaa's story as a child, approached James. "Sir," she said, "the lioness, she did something strange when we first approached. She bowed her head, just like in the stories. Do you think?" James smiled, his eyes misting with memories. "I think," he said slowly, "that trust, once truly earned, never really dies. It gets passed down, encoded somehow in the bonds between mother and cub, becoming part of who they are." Shujaa didn't just accept our help that day. She changed the very nature of how our species interact. As if in response to his words, the lioness lifted her head and looked directly at them. She was thin but not skeletal, tired but not defeated. She had accepted their help not from desperation, but from understanding. She knew, as her ancestors had known, that not all humans meant harm. Some, a precious few, could be trusted with the vulnerability of need. The sun set over the Ruaha National Park, painting the landscape in those eternal shades of gold and red. Somewhere in the distance, a lion roared, not in warning, but in declaration of presence, of persistence, of survival. The sound carried across the plains, reaching other prides, other rangers, other hearts that understood the message. We share this land, this life, this fragile and beautiful world. James closed his eyes and listened to the roar, remembering another lioness, another time, another impossible moment that had changed everything. Shujaa was gone, But her legacy lived on in every lion that chose trust over fear, in every human who chose compassion over protocol, in every moment when two species looked at each other and saw not predator and prey, not human and animal, but fellow travelers on a difficult journey, capable of helping each other survive. The drought would end, as droughts always do. The rains would come, the grass would grow, and life would flourish again. But the lessons learned in those desperate times, the bonds forged in moments of shared vulnerability, would endure. They would be told in stories around campfires, studied in universities, and most importantly, lived out in the daily interactions between humans and lions in this corner of Africa, where a dying lioness had once made an impossible choice that proved to be the most natural thing in the world: to trust, to hope, and to pass that trust on to future generations. As James prepared to leave the park for what would be the last time, he stopped at Shujaa's memorial. The plaque had weathered over the years, but the words were still visible. He placed his hand on the marker, feeling the warm stone beneath his fingers. "Thank you," he whispered to the memory of the lioness who had changed his life and the lives of so many others. "Thank you for trusting me when you had every reason not to. Thank you for showing me that the gap between our species isn't as wide as we thought. Thank you for proving that love and gratitude are not uniquely human traits, but threads that connect all living things." A rustling in the nearby bushes caught his attention. A young lion, probably no more than 2 years old, emerged partially from the vegetation. It looked at James with curious amber eyes, so reminiscent of Shujaa's. The lion made no move to approach or retreat, simply observed. Then, in a gesture that made James's heart skip, the young lion lowered its head in that familiar bow before disappearing back into the bush. James stood there for a long moment, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. The circle was complete, but the story continued. Somewhere out there, Shujaa's descendants carried on, living proof that a single act of compassion could echo through time, changing not just individual lives, but the very relationship between species. The impossible choice had become a lasting legacy, a bridge between worlds that would endure as long as there were those willing to cross it with open hearts and extended hands.